most of our clients see it very worth it to invest pretty significant dollars into a podcast, into advertising a podcast, because it's a nurturing tool. It's a community tool, as opposed to it primarily being an acquisition tool. That's kind of a transition that we've made over the last couple of years.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, it's Adam Adams. And generally, as you may have gotten accustomed to, any even-numbered episode is supposed to be me alone pouring into you and your business. However, I did so many different interviews with so many really, really good people that on this episode today, even though this would typically just be me pouring into your business, me just sharing something short, like 5, 10, 20 minutes, where I poured into you and your podcast and growing your brand and really getting you in front of everybody. I'm going to do that today with an interview. So let's get right into it.
What's up, podcaster? It's your host, Adam Adams, and today I am joined with Seth Silvers. Seth's got a company also that serves podcast hosts. He's had at least one other podcast. Seth, you'll have to let me know if you had any others. It went up to 99 episodes, so you're about to cross that 100, and you're switching to a new podcast. And so I've got a couple things that I want to talk about. I want to talk about why you're squashing a show and kind of like what the process might be in case somebody who's listening, they've got a show, they might have gotten up to 99 episodes or some other number, and they kind of feel like it's time to squash. So how do they do that? Let's jump in. Seth, tell me about your first podcast, the Small Business Storytellers. Why'd you start that? How about when and why?
Yeah, great question. So I probably started it in 2016. I don't think we published an episode till maybe 2018. There was about a year and a half where I knew I was going to start it. I spent maybe $1,500 on gear and bought a soundboard and mics and headphones and all that stuff and didn't really know what I was doing. And me and a friend, we recorded about 10 episodes in his office. They sounded terrible. I didn't know what I was doing with the gear. And I kind of just thought like, oh, I'm good at fixing things, so I'll fix this later. Like I'll be able to figure all of this out with the sound and the audio and all of that stuff. And I just sat on those episodes for a really long time. I didn't really want to put the work in. I kind of felt embarrassed that we'd recorded all these conversations. So about a year went by.
Why did you feel embarrassed?
I think I felt embarrassed because like I didn't do it right. Like there was like problems with the recording, and I didn't feel like I could publish it.
So at the time you recorded it, but you already knew that it wasn't right, but you didn't know how to make it right, or what?
Yeah, I think some of it was I didn't know how to make it right. I didn't know anybody else that was podcasting at the time. I didn't really know where to go for help, and I didn't really want to seek it out. And so I kind of just avoided it. I was like, I'll deal with it later. About a year went by in that kind of like, I have these episodes recorded. I don't think they're good enough to publish. There are some technical problems, and it's easier to just not do anything with them than to actually face what was going on.
So then what happened? Like you ended up publishing it. So
we just scrapped those first 10 episodes. I reached out to most of the people and just said, hey, there was some audio problems. I've learned a lot. And, I had done some test recordings now and actually.
So these were episodes with other people.
Yeah, with other people.
Okay, so you didn't just do solos. Did you have a co-host? You said me and a friend recorded.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, so it was kind of an interesting model. The vision behind the show was that I wanted to share stories of local businesses that I wanted to sit down and hear their story. There was a lot of businesses around in Fort Collins where they've been around for 50 years or 30 years or, passed down 3 generations. And I wanted to capture some of those stories and see what I could learn as a young business person from them. And I thought podcasting was a really great way to do that. And so the way we did it was I kind of facilitated these interviews. And then my friend he has like a local mastermind, like he does peer advisory groups for businesses. And we'd do the interview and then he would listen to the interview. We kind of have like a 10-minute segment at the end where he kind of pulled out some lessons for the audience. So it was kind of a unique format. It was way overcomplicated. There was too many moving steps. So I learned a lot from it because we had this brilliant idea of kind of this complicated format. And I underestimated how much it would cost and all of that stuff. And so it just caused the startup process of our podcast to be, I don't know, probably a year or two before I really figured out what I was doing.
And then tell us about when you started figuring out what you were doing. Was that 2018 or after?
Yeah, so I think it was 2018 when I'd have to honestly look at Apple Podcasts or look at our host to see when we actually published the first episode. I was kind of publishing it out of my company, is Story on Media, and was at that time as well. And part of it was just logistically, like I actually had an office space. I was in kind of a creative co-working space. And so we did some of these first interviews in somebody else's space. And we actually didn't even use the first handful of episodes. We didn't even use our equipment. We actually used somebody else's equipment because they were just
wait, but didn't you say you spent like $1,600 in equipment?
Yeah.
And then what did you do with all that?
We still have it and we ended up using it. But for those first like 4 or 5 episodes that actually got published, I think what got me across the line of actually getting it started was working with somebody else just being like, oh yeah, just come into like, we have this stuff. They were a videography company there. So they were like, yeah, just come on in and you can just use our stuff. And that was easier. So then I was like, okay, we can get this rolling because this is a little bit easier. And then that gave me some learning and I learned from them a little bit on how to use the equipment that I had. And so then we were able to actually kind of set up a studio in our office with the equipment that I bought. It was a longer process than I thought it would be.
Do you think you could think through this and give me like 4 things, give or take 4 things of what you were doing in like 2016 and 17, and then when it started to click in like 2018 and plus? Let's just say somebody's listening and they're in the beginning stages of this as well. What were a handful of those changes that you made when you started realizing like and knowing what you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one would be ask for help. Don't even just like not be afraid to ask for help, like just ask for help. And I think I didn't know other podcasters around the area. I didn't really know people that were doing it. And I didn't really take the time to like reach out and get to know people in the podcasting community, which is now I know is incredibly collaborative. Like you can always find somebody that wants to help you get your show off the ground. So that would be one, would be just be ask for help. I think 2 would be start simple and then over time add layers to it. So I started really complex. Like we were doing video, multiple video angles. We were doing this like post-interview format, which required me to do a soft edit of it and then send it to the guy who was kind of doing the post-interview format. So it was very complicated. Like it took a couple weeks of time. I was paying somebody on my team to do it all. I think that I probably, if I was speaking to myself back then, I would say, hey, do a really simple interview format. Start creating, start publishing, make it easy to publish, and then get complicated. Like not necessarily get complicated, but if you want to add layers of complexity or you want to improvise on the show, do that as you go rather than starting really big. I think start small, get bigger as you go. I don't know if I have 4, but those 2 things really stick out to me from that season.
I'm looking at, so you mentioned ask for help and then start simple, add layers. When you talked about a post-interview format, I don't know what that means. And that you were like, I just went to an interview format. So could you explain?
Yes, I would do the interview. So I'd sit down with you, hour or so interview. I had a videographer there, multiple camera angles, all that stuff. Then I would do an edit of the interview portion of the episode. Then I would send it to my friend Kurt, which Kurt has an awesome podcast now. And Kurt would listen to it. And then we would come together to record a here's 3 lessons from this interview. So it'd maybe be a 10-minute segment where there's kind of some banter and we'd record the episode, the intro to it. And so Kurt and I would be like, oh yeah, today I sit down with Adam Adams and, we talk about X, Y, and Z. Why do you think this is important, Kurt? And Kurt's kind of a local business expert here in Fort Collins. And so it made sense for him to be a part of it. But there was all these different segments and we couldn't possibly record them all at the same time because you don't know what lessons you're going to pull from something without having to record the interview and listen to the interview. It sounded really cool in my mind. And I think those first maybe 7 to 10 episodes follow that format. And I think they're pretty good. They're pretty interesting. And to this day, they're still some of the most listened to episodes we have. But it was unsustainable. And that was the thing for me, was it wasn't sustainable for me to keep doing it time-wise, money-wise, for the place that I was at in business at that time. It wasn't sustainable for me to do that. And I think that having a format as a podcaster that's sustainable is one of the most important things that you can do. And so now looking back, I would just figure out a way to say, okay, man, I'd love to do this one day. But right now, what's sustainable for me to do so that I could do this show weekly? Because with that show, we did those 99 episodes and we actually did 100 episodes. Kind of a funny story why it's now 99. But we did those over about 4 years. And so it was not 99 weeks in a row. It was kind of we'd go through some spurts of consistency.
Out of curiosity, so you did mention that you should have a sustainable format. And so I took notes and I wrote that down. And I'm curious, like when you're interviewing, like actually, let's go back and just see if we can get a third thing. Okay, so you said ask for help. You said start simple, add layers. Did you learn anything about interviewing people? Like, did you learn anything about asking questions? Did you learn anything about that from 2016 to 2018 or 19?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing I did learn with that is you should always prepare for an interview, even if you feel comfortable interviewing somebody. So I felt very comfortable interviewing somebody. I'd had quite a bit of experience doing it. One of the clients that I'd worked with in my marketing company for a while was a ghostwriting agency. And so the previous 2 or 3 years, I would talk with entrepreneurs and I would interview them for about 15 to 20 hours over a 3-month period. And then my client's editorial team would actually turn the transcripts from those interviews, they would turn it into a book. So I got really good at spending time with somebody that has all these ideas in their head, trying to formulate those ideas into an outline of a book and then interviewing them. And so I'd spent hundreds of hours interviewing different business owners and entrepreneurs and really interesting people over the last couple of years. So I felt comfortable sitting down and interviewing. And that's always been something that, like, just sitting down and talking with somebody is something that I feel comfortable in. But what I realized is the times that I would actually take time to prepare, rather than just being like, oh yeah, I know Tim Jordan, he's a friend of mine, I can sit down and have a good conversation with him. If I would actually take time to prepare, even if it was 5 minutes, hopefully it was more, but even if it was only 5 minutes, to actually sit down and think, what do I want the intention to be from this conversation? It was always better. So that was one thing, I think, coming into something where it's like, I feel pretty comfortable doing this, like way more comfortable than creating YouTube videos and other formats, like podcasting. Through the journey of the Small Business Storytellers, this was kind of the podcast that I learned the ropes of podcasting in. And I was figuring out the industry and I felt comfortable creating the content, but also realizing it might be good. Like with my natural skills, I might be able to show up and do a good job. And I might not even have to prepare to do a good job. And because it's taps into some of my natural skills. But if I do prepare, that's going to take that good to a great. And that was something that I learned then. And I still have to remind myself of that because it's comfortable for me to show up, but it will go to the next level if I really spend the time to prepare.
What takeaways would you give to another podcaster on how to prepare in the shortest amount of time, for example? How to actually be ready for an interview and set that intention so that it can be better?
Yeah, I think that we should never, and this actually gets into why I actually closed the show. If you get to the place where you're just doing interviews to do interview's sake, and you're just creating content just for the sake of creating more content, and because you've heard people say, if you have a business, you should have a podcast and you should interview your dream clients and all of that stuff, then you should pause and step back and say, why am I doing this? So I think, as speaking from my experience to a podcast host, I think that if you don't know why you're interviewing somebody, that's a problem. So I think you should always know, why do I want to interview this person? What do I want to learn from? Or on behalf of my audience, what do I want my audience to learn? Maybe what you want your audience to learn, you already know, but you have to put yourself in the shoes of your audience and say, what does my audience need to learn from this person? If you get to the place where all you're doing is just creating episodes to create episodes, and you just feel like you're in the rhythm of just cranking out interviews one after the other, and you're not really stepping back to say, why am I doing this? Then I think that's a problem. And that was one of the moments where I stepped back and I kind of said, why am I doing this? I feel like I'm doing 25-minute interviews. The first 5 is tell me about yourself. And, somebody's telling their story. Then they start pitching their stuff more than I feel comfortable with on my show. And then I'm saying, oh, thanks for, coming in here, share your stuff. And then, I edit the episode, we give it back to them, and then they don't share it with their audience. And so then I'm like, well, what in the world? And then I kind of realized, I'm just in this rhythm. And I would say there's probably a 30 or 40 episode space where I felt like it was just it just went by in a flash. And it was just I was kind of doing it to do it, as opposed to I had gotten away kind of from the roots of why I launched the show.
I like that. Content for content. If you're doing content for content's sake, pause. Be intentional. Make sure that you know what you want the listener to hear, what you want the listener to learn, what you want them to understand. And eventually that got you to taking down a podcast that I think you said you had for 4 years?
Yeah, I want to say it was probably about around a 4-year mark. We had 100 episodes, so it looked really good to stop on 100 episodes. And then I interviewed somebody, And it was really interesting. I don't even know if it was like that I didn't do my homework, because like publicly there's a lot that looks really good about this company I interviewed. I have never gotten so much negative. I've never really gotten, like, I wasn't publishing an episode and getting tons of feedback, but I published this episode and it was a couple months later, not even right when I published it. It was probably 3 or 4 months later. I had people sending me DMs on Instagram, on Facebook, sending me emails, initially saying like, this company has scammed us. We've been waiting for their product. Like, we've paid them and we haven't gotten a product for months and months and months. It was evident that like there was a community of disgruntled customers that then like got a hold of the show and they were like, we got to get this person, take it down. And it was really interesting because I like listened, I looked into some of their problems. I reached back out to the owner of the company and I just said, hey, I'm not accusing you of anything. I just said, hey, here's some of the feedback that I've gotten. I said, what do you suggest that I say to these people? And I never got anything back. And so then I responded back to all of them and said, man, I'm so sorry. I'm taking the episode down. We're taking everything down across the board that points to that episode. And I hope that you can figure it out, because it seemed like this company they were going through some pretty big problems and not really facing them. So that's why we have 99 episodes, not 100. Okay.
So let's go to this part. So 4 years, 99 episodes, not 100. Thinking about that averages out to be, would it be like one every month or like one every 3 weeks?
Yeah, I think like we usually like would go through, we'd maybe do like 6 months off and then kind of, do 20 or 30 episodes week to week to week. That was kind of the rhythm we'd do loosely.
And why would you take 6 weeks off? Like, what was the purpose of doing that?
There was no purpose behind it. It was because
you just got bored?
No, we
you got tired, you got busy.
I would say I got busy, and that's a bad excuse, but I think so. What started happening is when I started this podcast, then I started like, once I actually started it, my eyes opened to like see the podcasts around me. So then I saw, I knew a couple people that also had recently started podcasts. So I reached out to them and they needed help editing. And so I was like, okay, well, I have a marketing company, like, why not just add podcast services to it? So we started helping a few people. I think we were charging like $25 an episode to edit and publish an episode. So we were helping a few shows. And then over the next like year or two, the podcast was not my main goal. The podcast was something that I love doing, but my main goal was still, I got to build this marketing business. Like, this is something I'm passionate about both things, but this is the one that's paying my bills and helping me live. And so over that time, we started getting more podcasting clients, and I started seeing the benefit that the podcast had on my business. Even though we weren't inconsistent, there was people locally that were reaching out to me because of my podcast, or there was people that were in our sales process or sales pipeline for marketing services, and they'd listen to our podcasts and they'd feel like they trusted me more. So it's really interesting because I started to see the impact of it. And then we started just getting a handful of more podcasts as clients, or businesses that we were doing podcasts for. And then it was about 3 years ago in 2020 that I made the decision to like stop doing any other marketing services. And all we were going to do was help businesses launch podcasts and help businesses market through podcasting. So honestly, I just got busy and I'd record a bunch of episodes and then I'd kind of get busy and lose focus and start working on other things in the business. And that's been just a big journey for me in my business career, has been learning how to focus and learning how to be sustainable.
So you serve people that have podcasts and they have a business, and the business for them, the podcast is part of it. Is that right? You help people where the podcast is supposed to be top of the funnel, for example.
Yeah, okay. Yes and no. So most of the people, my perspective has shifted in the last like 18 months as I've realized that our target audience as a business is actually not podcasters. It's businesses that want to have a podcast but don't. And so most of the clients that we work with, they don't have a show when they're coming in, and we're helping them to, launch a show that helps as top of the funnel. It's usually one of their marketing assets. It's usually not their whole marketing strategy. But yeah, most of our clients are businesses that after working with us have podcasts.
So you say a couple things. First and foremost, you're saying that it's not their only marketing strategy. Their business isn't the only thing that they do is not podcasting. They're doing other things. With that in mind, for those clients, those people that you're serving, is the podcast worth it for them? Is it like a good thing that they're having a podcast? Do they stop doing the other things? Do they keep doing both? Or do they start the podcast, realize that it's not valuable, and just go to the other marketing strategies?
Yeah. So, naturally, there's some level of churn. There's some level of somebody starts a podcast, not 10 out of 10 people are going to say a year later, okay, this is super worth it. I think that's natural, but usually the people that we're working with, we call them established business leaders. So what that means to me is you have clarity on your audience, you have clarity on how you serve your audience, and you have a track record of doing it well. So those are typically the people that we're working with, where they are not looking at a podcast to make their business successful. Their business is already successful and they're looking at a podcast to help take it to the next level or help to nurture their audience. And so usually our clients, they have a fairly established sales process. They're acquiring leads. They have a fairly solidified product or service offering. And they're looking at, okay, now we've grown the business to a certain level. We're wanting to grow it further. We're wanting to go deeper with our audience. And we're wanting to usually create content that kind of expands our influence in the industry. So most of our clients, yes, they see it very worth it to invest pretty significant dollars into a podcast, into advertising a podcast, because it's a nurturing tool. It's a community tool, as opposed to it primarily being an acquisition tool. And that's kind of a transition that we've made over the last couple of years.
Let's talk about that client, that potential client, that person that you serve. And let's just say that you're trying to give them the best advice ever. They're feeling busy. They got a lot of work to do, and they take 6 weeks off.
Yep.
Or 6 months off. Do you recommend that to them? Do you say, yeah, you're too busy, just take 6 months off, no biggie? Or what would you say to your client?
Yeah, just to clarify, like you're saying, like they want to take 6 months off from doing the podcast.
Or they end up doing it. Here's the reason I'm asking this question, because you mentioned that you would work really hard. You personally, you would work really hard. You get a bunch of episodes out. Then you get busy. You have too much work. And then you just like let the podcast go for a while. And then you go back and forth and back and forth. Right. Would you recommend that to a client?
No, definitely not. There's a lot of things from the Small Business Storytellers that I would not recommend. There's a lot of things that I learned. And it was a great show for me to kind of like see the value of podcasting, but also see where there were many ways where I hijacked myself, and us not being consistent with it was one of those. In general, I stand kind of by the philosophy of like consistency is so important. But I think that consistency is different than frequency. So we tell our clients like it's more important to be consistent than frequent. So to explain that, like I would rather a client do 2 episodes a month for the next 3 years than do weekly episodes for the next 12 weeks and then realize I can't do this. They burn out, they shut it down. On the flip side, I would rather you do weekly episodes in maybe 3 seasons. And we're doing this for a client right now. So they're doing approximately like 40 episodes a year. So like loosely, or I think 45. So loosely 3 15-week seasons. And then they're telling their audience, hey, we're going to take a month off. And they're kind of communicating to their audience, and they're communicating from their business. For us to show up well 45 times a year, I need to not do anything for 3 months of the year or 2 months of the year. I think that's becoming more normal. And I think that, again, like if that's what you need as a business to be consistent, then I think that that's where you should go. Frequency is not the holy grail in podcasting, although frequency is super helpful. Like I think that you should publish episodes as much as you can in a way that is sustainable and isn't going to burn you out. But the ultimate goal is you got to be there in the long run. It's just it's going to look a little bit different for different people.
A lot of my friends and clients, they publish podcasts either like 4 days a week, 5 days a week, or maybe 7 days a week. If you had a podcast person coming to you, they wanted advice, and they felt like the frequency, they felt like they could easily do, let's just say 5 days a week. Would you try to talk them out of it, or would you say, yeah, that's going to be really valuable, definitely do it if you think you can sustain? What would be your answer?
So that's a tricky question. And one of the key shifts for me towards like really shifting towards my business being a podcast production agency was one of those conversations where somebody came to me and they said they'd seen some Gary Vee video and they were like, I need to have a daily podcast and I need to have it up in 48 hours. And they were the CEO of a pretty successful like health tech company in Manhattan. So it was right at the beginning of COVID. So I got a call from them and they said, hey, I want to start a daily podcast in 48 hours. Can you do it for me? And I was like, yep. And then I hung up the phone and was like, okay, crap, how am I going to do this? And that was actually like how I learned to build the engine that could manage all of those episodes. And I could manage the production of working on all of that at the same time. So it was super beneficial for me, but he did it for about 2.5 months. So my answer would be, first off, to really go down and ask why. Like, why is there a solid reason for why you're wanting to do this 3 days a week or 5 days a week? If there's a good reason and it makes sense for your audience, and I think there's some industries and some audiences where it totally makes sense. I don't think very many listeners are going to listen to all of the episodes, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. Like, there's different content strategies. So for me, I definitely wouldn't say no. It's not a no every time. I think it would depend on why. Like, ultimately, who's your audience? What questions are they asking? And what kind of content are you going to create and what frequency? Like, it's kind of working through those things of boiling it down to why. If it makes sense for your audience and you can sustain to do that, then that could be a really good thing.
I want to ask you, since you work with a lot of business podcasts, I want to find out kind of your advice that you would have for somebody who has a business podcast, a podcast where it's the top of the funnel, for example. Let's take a quick break. And when we get back, let's just talk about podcasting for business.
Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that, like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show.
We are back with Seth Silvers from the Small Business Storytellers podcast, and he's shutting that down, as you have heard so far, and he's going to be starting another one. We talked a little bit about how it was not really consistent, wasn't all the time. Sometimes he would take a few weeks off because he got busy, and how he wouldn't really recommend that to somebody who was doing a podcast, especially for business. His links are all in the show notes. So if you're looking to connect with him, if you want to get some advice, if you want to see either of his podcasts, the one that has been published and or the one that will be published after this interview, we'll go ahead and add the link as soon as he's live on that. So if you're listening to this, for example, in a few months from the day that it was recorded, awesome. That's great. Just scroll down and you can actually find the new podcast as well. So Built for Success, that's going to be the new one. And you can probably find that in the show notes. And his company is Story on Media. And that link is also in the show notes. And any of the social media he wanted you to have is down in the show notes. I want to talk a little bit about podcasting for business. Like, what advice would he have, since he does work with a lot of business podcasts? For you, if that's what you're doing, if you want your podcast to be making you money, let's find out what the words of wisdom of Seth Silvers are.
Yeah. So what I can do is I can kind of walk you through like the 4-step process that we walk every prospective client through. And the first thing I'll say, and I tell this to everybody, is I think the best way to make money from a podcast is to have a good business on the back end. So I think it is very hard to make money from podcasting through sponsorships at scale. And, you know, we have a lot of people that call us and they're talking about the podcast they just listened to, and they just heard an ad from BetterHelp or Athletic Greens or whoever it might be. And they're like, cool, I want to start a podcast. So these companies are hiring us and all that stuff. And I mean, Adam, you know that it's such a volume game that it's very challenging for most to get to that volume. But if you have 100 or you have 1,000 or you have 10,000 people that are listening that are in your dream audience for your business and you're helping them solve problems, then that is hugely valuable. So that's the first thing that we kind of always look at before we even walk through anything, is recognizing from our perspective, the best way to make money podcasting is to have a really good business on the back end that serves your audience. So to do that, we just walk through 4 really simple steps. The first is your audience. You got to know who your audience is. We tell our clients, if only one person listened to every episode that you produce in the next year and they did everything you recommended on it, who would that person be where their life would be totally changed and it would make everything worth it? So what would have to happen for only one person to listen, but it'd be totally worth it? Know who that person is. The secret is there's probably like hundreds of thousands of people like that one person. So first is audience. Second is knowing what problems or questions they have. And so you got to know what questions they have, what challenges are they facing. Third, you got to figure out what solutions you're going to give them. Are you going to be the one helping them with those questions? Are you going to bring guests in to help them with their questions? And then the fourth is having an offer. That could be a $7 ebook. That could be a free plus shipping. That could be a newsletter. But as a business podcast, you need to have a really clear avenue for a listener to start engaging with you off of the podcast. And a lot of people don't. A lot of business podcasts, they just assume if I just create content and I talk about what I do, then people will get in touch with me. And we just need to make it a little bit more clear. So those are kind of the four pieces that we walk any client through, or anybody that is a business owner looking to start a podcast, where you got to look at your audience, what questions or problems do they have? Third, how are you going to provide those solutions? And then four, having a clear offer or way to get them from the podcast into your business ecosystem.
I really like it. And what did you say about some people think that if they just have a podcast, something happens?
Yeah.
Go into a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people think that by starting a podcast and just by creating content, that their podcast is going to be successful. And people see Joe Rogan and people see a bunch of big podcasters and they're like, okay, cool. Well, he's just like sitting there talking with friends for 3 hours and drinking whiskey and smoking. So like, if he can be successful doing that, surely that I could be successful by talking about my business, which I really care about. And one, we forget that he's been doing it for like 10 or 12 years and his first episode sucked. So I think we're forgetting a lot of the journey. I think too, there's just this expectation where if we create the content, that means that the content is good. And this is something where we don't have to get too into the weeds, but like we should be looking at retention percentages as podcasters. Like that's one of the things where you're going to know if you're producing content and your audience is only listening to 10% of an episode, that means it's either the wrong audience or the content sucks. And a lot of podcasters are not willing to recognize that if your show isn't growing, that means that people are not sharing your show. And so we have to look at some of those things as opposed to just publishing it and being like, okay, just because I published a podcast means that my podcast is good. That's not necessarily true. We still have to actively work to improve the podcast. And I think we have a responsibility to improve it as much as we can over time.
I got tons of notes. Got tons of notes. I appreciate it. This is great. Let's wrap it up. I want to go through some of the things that we learned from you today. So there's just too much. There's too many notes. That's the only problem. It goes on and on and on. So here we go. First and foremost, like from the beginning of the episode, you really talked about the 2 or 3 things that you would do if you restarted. Like in 2016, you launch your podcast. In 2018, it starts to do a little bit better because you made some changes. What were some of the changes that you made? You asked for help. You want to start simple. And the interviews, you want to be more prepared for. You had a quote here that was interesting. I think consistency is more important than frequency. So as long as you're doing it regularly, that's a bonus, even sometimes more than frequency. Now, if you ask me, if you're working with our team, we want to make sure that you're at least publishing episodes at least once a week because you're going to trigger algorithms that are going to support your business growth. So, but if you want to do 10 a week or if you want to do 1 a week, we don't care, but just at least 1 a week. That way you can trigger some of those algorithms that the podcast playing platforms that at least feature you in front of other people, but they're not going to trust you if you're doing less than 1 a week. You talked about, Seth, communicating with the audience, and you actually said this a couple of times. You shouldn't just do content for content's sake. When you do that, it might be a good time to pause. So if your story was you felt like you were kind of just going through the motions, doing it over and over and over, but it was like, for what? What's the purpose? And now you kind of figured that after about 100 or 99 episodes because of the cool story, but you kind of figured that out after a few episodes. And then you said, hey, I'm going to rebrand. I'm going to do this over. I'm going to get consistent. I'm going to get serious. And we talked about, hey, if you're going to podcast for business, what do you do? And you mentioned, you've got to have a clear business strategy. And I think it's cool, Seth, that the way I look at this and the way that you look at this are very similar. So when you say that there's a 4-step process for the listener who wants to have a clear business strategy for their podcast, you mentioned First, you got to figure out your audience. You mentioned second, you need to figure out what problems they have. Third, you want to figure out the solutions that you're going to give them. And fourth, you are going to give them an offer. And on this podcast, I talk a lot about the first step being, I call it the avatar. You say it's the audience or know who that person is. And I love it. I say the avatar, know who that person is. So understanding that person is always that first step. For me, I always think about it as like, identify the avatar and figure out all of the things that hold them back, all the things that they're worried about, all the things that they need, all the things that they're looking for. What do they want to achieve? So that you can kind of get into like the psychographics, demographics of that human to be able to serve them. And again, one of my favorite things that you said is know who that person is. I think you said it like this. If you only had one person listening to your podcast that you could serve, yet that you could help, that you could bring them to the next level, who would that one person be? And what was interesting is, yeah, there's probably 100,000 other people like that, but we should just slow down and just think of a human. I'm going to give a quick call to action to the listener. So you can go to growyourshow.com/avatar. And it's just a 4-page avatar questionnaire that's going to help you know who that person is. It's going to help you understand how you solve their problems, because I agree with Seth. Once you figure out who it is, you got to figure out, how do I serve them? What do I do that's differently? What's my line in the sand? How am I going to serve them different than this other podcaster or this other business owner? Third, you said solutions that you're going to give them. I agree 100%. And then fourth, this is one that a lot of people miss. I don't know if you agree with that, Seth. I know so many business owner podcasts, and actually I'm working with one right now. There are 16 episodes in. Their episodes are about 5-ish minutes a piece. And I go to start listening to each of these episodes, and as I start to listen, I go, bro, do you have a business that's attached to this? He goes, yeah, I do. And he told me what the business was. He basically is a coach. He's a mentor. He basically, in a nutshell, he's a life coach. He helps people become the best version of themselves. And I'm like, you never share that. You never tell anyone that that's what you do. It's like you just give the content. So I want to ask you, Seth, like, how does the listener, because I think this guy, I mean, although he's super high level, he's a go-getter. He's done ultra marathons and stuff like that, like super good shape. His business is succeeding. He's made millions and millions of dollars over the last few years, but he's not asking an offer. He's not doing a call to action. So if I'm the listener and I'm hearing that step 4 is I need to have a call to action, and some people don't do it, they might be afraid of doing it. Like, what do I need to do to have a good call to action?
Yeah, I think it needs to be done well, which is intangible. So I apologize for that. But I think that part of the reason that people don't want to do it is because we've seen it done poorly. Like, we've all seen, we've all felt over marketed to, or we've all been listening to something and it's just like, man, that ad was terrible, or that was right in the middle of a sentence, or we've all seen call to actions and offers done terribly. And we're blitzed with ads every single day. The thing that people don't realize is I do not mind seeing an ad that solves a problem that I'm experiencing right now. I'm actually pretty excited about it. Like, if I hear an offer and that offer is helping me solve a problem that I currently have and I'm trying to figure out the solution to, and it's done in an authentic way, then that's great. So, I think the simple version is, if you're doing shorter episodes, like, you got to have an outro that mentions how can you help your audience. And if you can't help your audience, then why do you have a podcast, kind of? So I think that's one of the pieces where super simple, talk about how you can help your audience and have a clear way that they can contact you or have some kind of value that you can give them, whether it's resources or a call or something. Like, make your audience feel silly for not taking advantage of whatever offer you have at the end of an episode.
Yeah.
I think if you're doing longer episodes, like, a lot of clients will do like mid-roll ads or something where, sometimes we'll get client testimonials to where you're priming your audience to be familiar with hearing advertisements. Those ads are just for you. They're for your business instead of for someone else's. So those are a few ways that people can do it.
Yeah. I agree with you when you say it's kind of hard to make money through sponsorships for a podcast. I mean, you could do it. You can get a sponsor right away. You don't need a listener. I've helped people do that, but it's hard to make a lot of money through sponsorship. So I think it's better if you are able to sell your own product, your own service. If you can serve that person at a high level, I think that could be a huge benefit. And I got a couple other quick quotes. You're not going to be successful just because you have a podcast. And I always say, Field of Dreams is full of crap. Have you seen Field of Dreams?
Yeah.
If you build it, they will automatically come. Like, no, I'm sorry. You've got to do some marketing. You've got to get in front of people. You got to continue it. If we create content, you say, it doesn't mean it's good. Just because we have the content doesn't mean it's serving somebody, doesn't mean it's helping somebody. Another is, if your show isn't growing, it means people aren't sharing your show. So be thinking about, how do I make something share worthy? How do I make something where somebody's listening to it now, and then they're thinking like, oh, I got to share this with, and then they say somebody comes to their mind and they're going to send it. We still have to actively improve the podcast. We have a responsibility. So once you've launched that, once you've started your show, you've got a responsibility to be able to serve and maintain and stay in front of those people. And I hope that you have a good call to action. Seth, do you have a call to action today?
Yeah, so I don't, because my main call to action would be to stay in touch, because we're launching a new show called Built for Success that will be fun. And I would just say, if people want to get in touch with me, we're happy to help in any way with people that are wanting to launch or grow their podcast. I also know, Adam, you do really good work in that space too. So part of the reason that I don't necessarily have a call to action is because my hope is that you're already serving your audience really well and helping them launch and grow their shows. But if people want to get in touch with the work we're doing at Storyon Media, you can find our website in the show notes, or just head over to storyon.co. So happy to connect with any of the listeners.
Also, he's got a meetup group. So pretty big meetup group. From some of the people that I've heard have gone there, they said that he packs the room. There's tons of podcasters. It's called Colorado Podcasters Meetup.
Yeah, we got real fancy with the name. So yeah,
that's SEO right there.
Yeah, a couple times a year. We just facilitate it. We just try and bring everybody together in the room and let everybody network. But we put on a couple networking events for the podcast industry in Colorado. I think the last couple events we've had between 80 and 120 people that show up. Some are podcast industry, some are brand new, some are podcasters that are making tons of money doing it. We have a lot of amazing podcasters here in Colorado.
So if you're out of town and you want to fly in, look it up. And if you're already in Colorado, probably want to be a part of that. You probably could get some good guests, or be featured on other people's shows by meeting and rubbing shoulders with other people that are doing it, or even learn something about your microphone or the other types of equipment that you have, or how to interview. You probably learn something. Good stuff. I'll probably be at the next one. I know that you've put it up, so I'll probably be there most likely. I look forward to it, and I hope that the listener can follow your stuff in the show notes to your website, to your old podcast, and the one that you're launching now. I'll see you guys on the next episode.
Oh, hey, because 3 of my clients came to me recently looking to find a way to have their podcast make them money instead of cost them money. We put together a resource for some of our clients, and I want to give it to you as well. It's something that did actually seem to help, because one of them is now making $2,600 a month. Another one's $4,500 a month. And the third is making between $5,000 and $10,000 each month. And so it's been a resource that's been incredibly valuable to them. It's our sponsor sheet template. It's a template of a sponsor sheet, and it gives you something that you can hand to potential sponsors, and hopefully also be making $2,600, $4,500, or between $5,000 and $10,000 regularly each month with your podcast. So this has been a contributing factor to helping all 3 of those clients turn their podcast into an additional income stream for them. And the way that you can find it is just going to our website, growyourshow.com, but put in /templates, growyourshow.com /templates. And then you can actually download that template and others that could be valuable to your podcasting experience. I'll see you on the next episode.